We live in a remarkable city which has a remarkable history, and I'd like to go through some of it with you tonight. St. Marcus has been a proud ministry within the city for 150 years, but we're actually, as you'll hear if you come to the last one in the series, which is the history of St. Marcus, we're actually not part of the original city. That was much smaller. We are in the next wave. I call St. Marcus a second wave congregation. We are in the 6th ward, and Milwaukee, when it was chartered in 1846, had 5 wards. You've probably heard of the 5th ward, also known as Walker's Point. Most people have heard of the 3rd ward, which is south of downtown. Right above it is the 1st ward. That was where the wealth and leadership of the city first lived, what was also called Yankee Hill. And then Byron Kilbourne and his group of crazies on the west side of the river had the 2nd and the 4th ward. The 4th ward is where the west side Protestants generally were located, and then when Marquette University moved and set up shop on Wisconsin Avenue, that became kind of a powerhouse for Catholicism. But there weren't too many Lutherans. In fact, it was many decades before there was a Lutheran church on Wisconsin Avenue. But Kilbourne, the center of gravity of Byron Kilbourne's settlement was 3rd and Juneau, and that became the 2nd ward. And that's where most of the Lutherans ended up. But more about that in 3 weeks. The original Native Americans who lived in Wisconsin were what are loosely called forest Indians, very different from the Plains Indians. The forest Indians, there were not a lot of bison in Wisconsin, but they did shoot a lot of deer. They were able to be armed with bows and arrows. But basically, the Native Americans who lived here before Columbus bumped into the Dominican Republic, where he landed on his journey, and where the Spaniards spent basically the first century doing their main exploration and settlement. The Caribbean was Spain's first place. They did not sink too many resources into North America. They left that for the British. And so in what is today the continental United States, mostly did not really start getting settled with Europeans until the 1600s. But in the 1500s, the Spaniards settled in the Caribbean, Florida, and then actually went through Mexico and up in the early 1600s, got up into New Mexico. Santa Fe is one of the amazingly oldest cities in America, even though it's in the far southwest. I believe Santa Fe was started in 1660, and by the middle 17s, there was a string of missions all the way up the coast of California. But we were up here in the woods and sort of took our turn waiting for settlement to get to it. Obviously, the Indians did not have a written language, and it's very hard to get authoritative facts and dates about the history of the Native Americans in the forest region. But there's a few things we can go on. Historians estimate that when this part of the U.S. came under British control after the French and Indian War concluded in 1763, there might have been 9,000 or 10,000 Native Americans in the whole state. They were very thinly populated. There were no great cities. There weren't even any middle-sized or small cities. They were hunter-gatherers who moved around with their teepees, and they would go where the hunting and the fishing were the best. They sometimes would do a little planting. Some very early maps of Milwaukee show where there was a field of maize or corn that a local clan had planted, and they would do a little of that. But you didn't really have to work too hard to eat well in Wisconsin when there were so few people over such a large land. The fishing was easy, the wild rice was plentiful and everywhere, and of course the forests were full of deer, and the Indians took full advantage of that. These are rough estimations of where some of the different clans of Indians lived in the state, but there were no surveyors, so these lines are not bright and clear. They're just general regions. Way up in the northwest are the Ojibwe. You probably know them by their more popular common Wisconsin name of Chippewa. But the way that the tribes today prefer to be known is Ojibwe. The Dakota around the La Crosse area, they're part of the Sioux Nation, and they stretch way far west. There were Sioux families all over the upper Midwest. The Ho-Chunk is the modern name that the tribes preferred to use, but one of the other tribes at that time had given them the name of Winnebago, which is how we've named our lake, and I think Winnipeg, Canada, is also named for their old name, and the name in English has stuck, but the tribes today prefer to be known as Ho-Chunk. The Menominee are in the northeast, and you can see, if your eyes are sharper than mine, you can probably see it says Oneida there. And then Potawatomi around the Milwaukee area, and also in the southwest on the what became the Iowa border. The tribes were not all related. Three of them are more original: the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, and the Dakota Sioux were the original tribes to be here. And the Potawatomi, the Ojibwa, and the Fox are what are called Algonquian tribes. They came from New York, and there were massive Indian conflicts out east, not just between the Indians and the settlers, who sometimes they felt were encroaching on their lands, but the Indians fought with each other too. Because once the Europeans came, the Iroquois figured out that there were great profits to be made by trading, and they wanted a monopoly on the trade with these Europeans, because they wanted to be the ones to bring in the animal pelts, and they saw it as essential to their survival that they had exclusive trading rights, because they needed the barter and the money to be able to buy horses and guns, which are now the new way to define warfare. Obviously, there were no guns in the North American continent before Columbus got here, but there was a lot of stuff they didn't have. Some people would call these Stone Age cultures. They had no metal industry. They were not even into the Bronze Age yet. They used stone. They did not have the wheel, meaning no vehicles of any kind existed in North America before the Spaniards got here. They also had no draft animals. The horse was a gift to North America from Europe. So were oxen and cows. There were no draft animals at all. So everything that the forest Indians had to move had to be dragged by human power. And the only device they came up with what the French called a travois, which was basically two long sticks lashed together at the end, and you would grab them like you're holding a wheelbarrow backwards, and they would, with deer hide thongs, they would lash their burdens onto that thing tapering behind them, and you could drag it. But that is the only way they could move stuff around. So clearly, these were not city builders. The Indians of Wisconsin got a great surprise in the year 1634. The French had decided they were going to make a play for the whole St. Lawrence River Valley, which then connected to the Great Lakes, and they claimed all the Great Lakes, and they claimed the whole Mississippi. Various French explorers came to various of those places, and they had the idea, this lovely romantic idea, that whoever saw it first could claim it for the whole nation. So Jean Nicolet was an explorer who came through Wisconsin in 1634 and claimed it all for France. And there was nobody around who could speak French to argue with him, or English, or any other language for that matter, and so he claimed it all. Sieur de la Salle claimed Chicagoland and Illinois, and others traveled up and down the Mississippi, claimed the Mississippi, and so the French, what they called New France in America, went from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River all the way through the heartland of North America, and then down to the port, the significant port that the French called Nouvelle-Orléans. We call it New Orleans. They called it Nouvelle-Orléans. And you might wonder what this scene represents. He was greatly aware of being heavily outnumbered wherever he went, so he wanted to make an impression of dazzling wealth and glory and also scare the waste out of them all. And so he shows up in this Chinese robe with 2 pistols, which he would discharge when he was introducing himself. And that, of course, caused any warlike moves by the Native Americans to kind of control themselves a little bit. And then he brought gifts to show he was peaceful. So he was not interested in starting any military conflicts. There was only a couple of Frenchmen in a canoe, but he wanted to trade with them. And that really was the French gig in all of their territory. The French never sent lots of Frenchmen to colonize North America. At the height of New France, they maybe had 1 million inhabitants, all the way from the St. Lawrence mouth all the way down to New Orleans. Whereas by the time of the French and Indian War, which was a bitter conflict for control of North America, at least our part of that war, the British by then had probably 9 million colonists on their Atlantic seaboard properties. Following Jean Nicolet in 1634, another French visitor came with a very different purpose in 1673. This is Father Jacques Marquette, who was a Jesuit who came to proclaim Christianity and had a very different presence that he brought. He was very much liked and appreciated by the Native Americans because he brought things that could help people, and they called him the Black Robe. And he set up missions and brought things like education and Christianity, but also social help. He showed that he really cared about how the Indians were doing. In 1763 was the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. Here is a map of Wisconsin drawn by some French explorers, and it's not too bad considering that they didn't have satellites to work with or laser pointers or anything. This was all done with very crude surveying instruments. But you can see Green Bay up there on the upper right-hand corner, Lac Supérieur. The French, Garrison Keillor said, you can tell the French named Lake Superior because if the Minnesotans had named it, they would have called it Lake Pretty Good. You can see all of the tributary rivers flowing into the Mississippi at the left. You can see Lake Winnebago connected by the Fox River to the bay. They have Milwaukee a little bit high. Milwaukee, last I checked, is farther south than Lake Winnebago, but this was scratched out as best they could. And you can also see where the Fox River and the Wisconsin River almost connect. Right next to the P in Partee, you see that the 2 rivers, one flowing to Lake Michigan and the other flowing to the Mississippi, almost touch. That's because there's a high ridge of land through there and the water flows in opposite directions. And there is a city there today that actually, you may not have known it, but it's actually a French name. The French used that to carry their goods and their canoes and carry them across that hump of ridge of land so then they could keep sailing it, continue their trip. And the French called it a portage. And so today, that is the Wisconsin town of Portage. Good, you're way ahead of me tonight. This is going to be good. Here is right before the French and Indian War. Here is what North America looked like. Now, you shouldn't assume by that gigantic blue splash on the map that the French had colonized all that land. They were basically huddled along the rivers, and they had a few military forts, dreaming that someday they were going to control all of this. Their main fort was right about where Pittsburgh is now, was called Fort Duquesne, and it was the joining together of the 3 rivers that formed the Ohio River. And that was the loose boundary between the British settlements and the French settlements. The French did not want the British crossing the Ohio River. Went all the way down to New Orleans. The golden area are Spanish possessions. Florida was Spanish for a while. Eventually, by 1819, it was sold to the United States. They have a long presence in Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, all the way up to the Oregon border, was claimed by Spain, although they never had enough inhabitants to really mount a defense. When the Americans showed that they were interested in annexing that part of the world, it didn't take too long, and California became part of the U.S. The red areas are the British seaboard colonies, the original 13 plus Maine, and I think Vermont also was not one of the original 13. They came, I think, in 1791. But the Titanic battle that took place, I think, is almost as important as our Revolutionary War. The French and Indian War ended up with the British, who got pushed around and beat up a lot in the early years of that war, stuck with it, and they sent a military expedition in about 1761 or so, and invaded Canada, and actually stormed and took the key city of Quebec, and killed the French commander Montcalm. And the French then decided, the French surrendered soon after that, and decided in their treaty to give up all of their North American holdings, and Canada and the whole Mississippi, Great Lakes and Mississippi River became British possessions. The British had cleverly seized two French islands in the Caribbean, Guadeloupe and Martinique. And those two islands, the French thought, were worth more than all of Canada and the whole Mississippi basin because of the sugar money that they would make off of the cane plantations there. So the British sort of gave them those two islands back and in exchange took Canada. I'll leave it to you to see what you think of that deal. After the Revolutionary War, the United States not only got possession of their colonies, they also got the entire Northwest Territory. That's all of this up here. And here's where our story comes in, because this is us right here. We were actually claimed by Massachusetts originally, which I'm glad we pried their slimy fingers off our state. I don't want to be owned by Massachusetts. But they didn't even know where their western border was when they first drew the lines. So all the states, all the original colonies, drew the lines of their claims all the way into the interior. None of them were too clear where the Mississippi River was, but they all drew their lines extending infinitely west. And after the war, they yielded all of their claims to the federal government. This Florida state's Spanish for a while. This area was claimed by the U.S., although it was heavily populated by Indians. This is where the famous Trail of Tears came from. The Cherokee lived in Alabama and Mississippi. So here is what things look like now in 1790. Here's the Northwest Territory. Eventually became 5 states. One by one, their populations of their territories reached size sufficient to be admitted to statehood. First Ohio, then Indiana, then Illinois, then Michigan, and the last of the Northwest Territories was Wisconsin. We achieved statehood in 1848. And up here's a little piece of Minnesota that is east of the river. Most of Minnesota, as you can see, is west of the river. These are some of the earliest works of construction in Wisconsin. Milwaukee was not a thing for a while. Milwaukee is not the oldest city or settlement in the state. The first important places were 2 forts that the British built and that the U.S. took over. One was here. The French actually built it first. They called it Fort l'Abbaye, which is French for the bay, so the Bay Fort. And one was here at the mouth of the Wisconsin River, and the French called it Dog Prairie. And we call it Prairie du Chien, Prairie du Chien. And the British built a military road, and the Americans then later improved it, getting from one fort to the other, either sailing on the rivers or overland, was thought to be of first importance to link up the Great Lakes with the Mississippi. And Milwaukee was nothing yet in these days. The Fort LaBaye, I believe, was built like about 1760. So Green Bay is actually a much older settlement than Milwaukee. Here you can see a sudden rash of towns and forts being built. You get extra beer, a free beer, if you can tell me why the development of Wisconsin started here. Who knows? Lead mining, correct. And who cares about lead? Everybody cared about lead. Why, Nate?
For ammunition.
Ammunition, need bullets. It was real close to the surface, and you didn't have to dig too deep. There were seams of lead that were visible, and the miners, especially Cornish from Cornwall in England, came over. And so some of the very first Europeans in Wisconsin were these lead miners, and that's how our state got its name, because they obviously didn't have time to build grand houses. They first had to get an income stream started. So they dug caves and dugouts and sod huts for themselves on the hillsides, and they were mocked as like being badgers with their heads poking out of their holes. And that nickname stuck. So we are, ever since the lead miners, the Cornish lead miners, we have all become badgers. That, by the way, is where the first capital, the state capital, was at Belmont before it was moved to Madison. You can still see some of that. There are stone houses in immaculate shape that were built in 1830. What town do you go to see these amazing houses? Mineral Point, correct. What a sharp group tonight. There were French fur traders who would travel and set up temporary trading posts all along the Mississippi and all along the coastline of Wisconsin, never settling there very long. At this time, before 1820, there were no permanent European residents in Milwaukee, and we'll get to that story of the first one in just a minute. But this is the most significant catalyst for the birth of Wisconsin. Do you know who that is? That is Black Hawk. Black Hawk was a Sioux, and the Sioux and the federal government had signed a treaty in 1804 that paid the Sioux a significant amount of money if they would all kindly move across the Mississippi into Iowa and Minnesota. This was especially important for people in Illinois, but the Wisconsin people were aware of that too. And economists today and historical analysts say the money given was maybe worth only 50% of the land value at that time, but who's to know? And who's to know what's fair or right or whatever? The point is that the treaty was accepted and the Sioux moved. But in about 1830, Black Hawk decided to renege on that treaty. He was angry, and he missed his old hunting grounds on the east bank of the Mississippi River in northwestern Illinois, which now was overrun also with lead miners. What is the big lead mining town in Illinois? Galena. Good for you. You knew that. Also, a wonderful day trip if you ever want to spend a day driving out there, walking around, have a nice dinner, and sleep in a B&B, and then drive back. It's a beautiful old city. It's where Ulysses Grant spent some of his pre-war years working in a retail store where he failed miserably. But his beautiful big house is still there that the proud citizens of Galena bought for him and begged him to settle in. Black Hawk and his band, it was called the British Band because they had loyalty still to the British against these Americans. They were afraid of both of them, but they feared the Americans more because they stayed. They came, took land, settled on it, and that was that much less hunting ground for them. So Black Hawk came back in 1830. The year later, he came back again with about 1,000 braves and spent quite a bit of time in the Galena area and southwest Wisconsin, Prairie du Chien, south and southeast of there. And then in 1832, he came back again, and the Illinois people were really nervous and real jumpy, and they called up the Illinois militia to persuade the Sioux to go back across the river according to the treaty they thought had been settled 30 years earlier. And crazily enough, the Black Hawk War broke out between Indian tribes, not between the settlers and the natives, but between two Indian tribes, and there was a massacre of some of the Fox Indians. They called themselves the Mescawi or something like that. I can't remember the exact term. And they called up the Illinois militia, who were seriously underrepresented. Their force was too weak, and the first clash turned out to be a rout against the Illinois militia, and they had to retreat, and it was a general panic. And the governor called up, he about quadrupled the militia, and they went at it again. And after a series of scuffles, including some massacres of settlers, the Wisconsin militia also called up troops. In fact, one of the companies of the Illinois militia, their captain was someone whose name you might have heard of. His name was Abraham Lincoln, although he did not happen to see any action. His term of enrollment expired before his company was sent into battle. But eventually, the Illinois and Wisconsin militias won a string of I shouldn't say major victories, but overwhelming victories going up into Wisconsin, around the Fort Atkinson area, around the Rock River, and then they chased them towards Prairie du Chien, and there was a considerable loss of life among the natives, and Black Hawk was captured. And the rest of the Indians then scrambled like mad to get to a safe place like Minnesota, although I'm sad to say, about 30 years later, the Minnesotans had their own problems with the Sioux. There was a massive Sioux uprising, of all places, in New Ulm, Minnesota, and Mankato. In fact, Mankato, Minnesota, is famous in all of the United States for a variety of things, having Bethany Lutheran College is one of them. But they're even more famous for another thing. Does anybody happen to know? The largest public execution in American history took place in Mankato, where the 30 or so ringleaders of the Sioux, who were fingered as having fomented the rebellion that caused quite a bit of loss of life, including settlers who were butchered and massacred. Those 30 were all hanged in Mankato. So if you ever go to Mankato, you will see a monument today, although it's an apologizing monument. Minnesotans are now sorry they did it, but you can still see where that happened. So after Black Hawk, by the way, so this is so interesting to me, Black Hawk was taken captive by, the militia handed him over to the Army, and you know who the Army colonel was who took him down to St. Louis to exhibit him? Jefferson Davis. Yes, the President of the Confederacy. Isn't that crazy? So land can now be sold. The first guy to use his connections was Solomon Juneau, who was one of these traveling French fur traders, but he decided to make Milwaukee his home. So we kind of think of him as Milwaukee's first citizen, Solomon Juneau. And here was his cabin and his trading post. Later on, he actually put frame boards on his cabin, and so he's also famous for having the first frame building in the state of Wisconsin. He and his wife, who was part Indian, she was, I think, 1/4 Indian, Josette, I think her name was, lived in this cabin since about 1820. So that is now the first European settler living full-time in Milwaukee. His father-in-law, Jacques Vieux, used to travel through and had a seasonal trading post, but then when it got too cold in winter, he'd go back somewhere warmer. This place you're looking at is on the corner of what is today Water and Wisconsin, where the 100 East skyscraper is located. Here is what Milwaukee looked like when the truce with Black Hawk happened and the Milwaukee Land Office was opened up, and when they started making land sales. You can see that Milwaukee's reason for existence, number one, it's right on the lake. So when there's a state with no roads, everything moved best in the first generation by water. So bringing stuff from the east that people would need, farmers and settlers would need, was done best by floating it on the Great Lakes. And you can see there's a big bay denting here, and so Milwaukee has a lovely bay, giving ships a little bit of protection. You also can see 3 rivers coming together. What are the names of Milwaukee's 3 rivers? The Milwaukee, which is probably one of the most significant historical stuff, that goes through up the east side and then makes a 90-degree turn and basically goes straight north. The one that goes straight west and meanders to the west and north is Menominee. And the little guy on the south side, Kinnickinnick, usually in Milwaukee called KK. Here is Milwaukee in 1840, and you can see in some ways why the development of the city was kind of slow. All of that crosshatch area are the swamps around the rivers. The rivers now have nice, tidy, precise walls and embankments, but those are all iron pilings that have been sunk into the muck that give the river a nice, tight shape. But back in the day, what is now the 3rd Ward was so spongy and soggy you couldn't build anything on it. Everything around the Menominee, all the way through the middle of the city where the Brewers Stadium is now, was all underwater. It was just a wet marsh. Great place if you wanted wild rice and fish. A bad place if you were trying to build a factory. There was high ground on the northwest side, some high ground on the east side, and on the south side, right here, there was only this little spit. Now, the east side, 160 acres of this prime land was bought by Solomon Juneau. He got first pick, and it's probably because he had a business partner in Green Bay where there was money and access to capital. So he was able to get the loan he needed to buy such an enormous wad of land. This was probably considered city land. It would have been more expensive than, or future city land, more expensive than a 160-acre farm, because he wasn't going to farm it. He was going to subdivide it and sell those thousands of lots off one at a time. But it took a big outlay of capital to get it done, and only a few people could do that. Byron Kilbourne bought 160 acres on this side of the river. He was a surveyor and a canal builder from Ohio, and he came to Milwaukee and decided to make that the center of the city. And the two sides hated each other. They did not get along. When they would show maps of the city, Kilbourne's maps showed Milwaukee only existing here. This was all just a blank. A Virginian named George Walker bought or tried to buy this part, what became the 5th Ward, but it took him 10 years to get a clear title to it. He had so many squatters that he had trouble evicting or forcing to buy, making them now buy the land their house was on. They didn't like the idea that somebody had bought the land from underneath them, but before 1835, nobody had clear title to anything. It was all part of the territory, and the federal government owned it all. So George Walker eventually got title to what we call the South Side, and that is why the 5th Ward to this day is called Walker's Point, because here's the point, right here. Here is the city, also about 1840. You can see that Juneau's got everything platted from about Clybourne all the way up to, this was Division Street, now it's called Juneau. So he got the jump on everybody else, and all of the government buildings and all of the houses of the more well-to-do people were here on Yankee Hill, on the bluffs overlooking the lake. Byron Kilbourne was coming in number 2, and the center of his settlement was on 3rd and Juneau. And you can see how far behind Walker was. There's only a few cabins that have been identified here, and a lot of swampland would have to be filled in. Great thing about Milwaukee is it had much bigger bluffs than there are today, and they would use horse-drawn grader bars and would cut down the bluffs and shove all that dirt into the swamps and thus make that land usable. In 1845, tensions had gotten to the breaking point between Kilburn's settlement and Juneau's settlement, and it focused on the bridges. For one thing, those two settlements crankily did not jointly survey and lay out their streets. So Kilburns are pretty much 90 degrees north and south and east and west. But for reasons I don't fully understand, Juneau made his blocks a little skinnier, so there's an extra street on the east side. Did you ever notice it? What's it called? Mason Street. Block north of Wisconsin, on the east side, there's an extra street before you get to Wells. Also, the east side streets are not lined up square. They're tilted. And the real flame of contention was the bridges. As I said, Kilburn needed boats to be able to get all the way up to 3rd Street, but whenever the East Siders built bridges, that would block the boats. And so the Kilburn's West Siders would tear the bridges down so that their boats, you can see one right here, this boat is trapped. And the early bridges, although maybe they tried to have them be like you could take out a section so the boats could get in and out, it was such a pain that the West Siders kept wrecking them. And so if you can see right here, the East Siders brought a persuader. You see that little item there? They had a cannon and they had powder, but they did not have any cannonballs. You could scare them, but they figured they would need something. And they were so angry at Kilburn, they aimed the gun at Kilburn's house, and the only thing they could find to shoot at Kilburn's house were clock weights. You know, the heavy, like cuckoo clock weights or sash weights to pull clocks down. They loaded up the barrel with sash weights and aimed the gun at Kilburn's house, and Kilburn's daughter had just died the day before, so there's like a funeral, everybody's in mourning, and so people ran across and said, "Stop, you can't do this." And wiser heads who were not half drunk got everybody calmed down, and they actually went and had some meetings and formed a commission to incorporate the city along with Walker's smaller settlement on the south side. And the following year, in 1846, Milwaukee was incorporated with 5 wards, and the Bridge War was over. Milwaukee County had 8 townships. Here is the city. Milwaukee County's midpoint right here from top to bottom is 27th Street. So this drawing is from the 1880s, but you can see even in 1885, the western border of Milwaukee was only 27th Street. It only went up about as far as Keefe Avenue on the south side, maybe about Lincoln or so. This was the town of Milwaukee. This was all unincorporated township. This was all farmland with a couple of tiny little settlements. It was called the Township of Granville. You can see the 2 big highways, now called Appleton and Fond du Lac, running this way, and there were a lot of train tracks going through here. This is the Township of Wauwatosa. 36 square miles. Each of these little squares is 1 square mile. This is the township of Greenfield, and this is the township of Franklin. This is the township of Oak Creek, and this is the township of Lake. Now, Oak Creek looks substantially like this today, and so does Franklin. The city eventually expanded and chewed up some of Greenfield, took some big bites out of Wauwatosa Township, and got almost all of Granville Township. A little bit of River Hills and Brown Deer come up in this corner. And eventually, the reason the city couldn't expand north anymore was they had a big amusement park in Estabrook Park. It was called Wonderland, and the future Shorewood residents, I should say the residents who were in the future going to be named Shorewood, were sick of all of the beer drinking and carousing and lights and racket and the Ferris wheel going around, and people misbehaving as people have been known to do occasionally. And so they incorporated and put a stop. Once you incorporate, Milwaukee can't annex you anymore. Milwaukee got to its present size by jumping on unincorporated real estate. And the townships hated it, but until the people incorporated, there was nothing they could do to stop it except argue and beg. Eventually, Milwaukee got surrounded. The suburbs now surrounding Milwaukee have all incorporated. So city politicians call that the Iron Ring, like the Ring of Death. There's nowhere for Milwaukee to expand anymore. All of the surrounding suburbs have incorporated. But Milwaukee got quite a bit. Here's a little rough map of what Milwaukee looks like today. This chunk got eaten out of the town of Lake, the western two-thirds. The eastern third is St. Francis, Cudahy, and South Milwaukee. They didn't get anything below here. This is Franklin. This is Greenfield Township, and you can see there's a chunk of the southwest tip of the city ate up some of Greenfield, and some of it that runs along the freeway corridor. There's a tongue of Milwaukee that goes out to the county line. They ate, looks like about a third of Wauwatosa and most of Granville. Milwaukee had a very powerful weapon to play to strong-arm neighborhoods into being willing to be annexed. Actually, two. One medium-sized lever and one big lever. What were those? Anybody know? Water. City water. When Milwaukee County had only, 100,000 people in it, you could provide water for 100,000 people with a lot of wells. Once the population kept growing, they exhausted the wells, and they needed to get a soda straw into Lake Michigan. But Milwaukee sat on all the approaches. And Milwaukee had two gigantic pumping stations and would happily sell you water. But welcome to Milwaukee. First, you have to let us annex you. Also, the sewers. There's limits to how much fun it is to have a septic tank in your backyard. And people thought it would be much more fun if you could just connect a pipe and everything, all your waste would go away. And there's a lot to be said for that point of view. Here is Milwaukee as if we are a seagull flying back out to the lake to look for some fish for lunch. This is looking eastward right along Wisconsin Avenue. It's called Grand Avenue back then. And you can see that the city stops right here at Clybourne. This is what's now the 3rd Ward. It's very low ground. This was all infill. And the city pretty much stopped at about Juneau. This is in the 1850s. But you can see by now there's a bunch of bridges. They have stopped fighting. And they've also invented swivel bridges. They would build a pier, or like a pedestal in the middle of the river with a pivot joint on it. And there would be a set of gears that could be cranked so that it was a swing bridge. The bridge would actually pivot on that pier, or that piling, you might say, and boats could pass by, and then you could swing it shut. So that stopped the bitterness between the east and west banks of the river. This is from 1872. Howard Heston Bailey and his office drew up a fabulous aerial view of what Milwaukee looked like. And I could spend all day poring over that, and you would probably too, because you like Milwaukee almost as much as I do. Here's the new access cut into the river to give it a harbor without a sandbar. The old access to the river was farther south. And the new cut was right here. They called it the center cut. Here's the Milwaukee River. Here is the future St. Marcus. We're going to come into existence about 3 years after this drawing was done. So St. Marcus's neighborhood is truly on the edge of town. Here is the Menominee River. As you can see, it's all wet. It's just a soaky mess in there. Until the canals were all cut, and then a lot of fill A lot of the bluffs were cut down and the dirt shoved into the valley. This eventually became prime industrial real estate. Thankfully, people didn't want to live there. There was a collection of some of the stankiest, dirtiest, messiest industries, and the city had a place to put them where they wouldn't annoy the neighbors too badly. I'm old enough to remember the Milwaukee Tallow Company. Do any of you remember the Milwaukee Tallow Company? When you would drive over the high-rise bridge on a hot summer day, the smell rose to high heaven because it was a tallow rendering plant. They would take butchered animals' carcasses and melt down all of the fat that was left, because you know tallow is a usable substance. But the smell there was abominable. And here is Walker's Point, which has now been connected by a string of bridges, including railroad bridges. And this became Milwaukee's first its second industrial area. The first was along here. More on that when we talk next week about the history of Brewers Hill. This was actually Milwaukee's first industries along here, and I'll tell you that story next week. This is 1860. This was the Market Hall downtown, also the first City Hall. I really like that building. I think it's a beautiful and elegant building. Built on the same spot where City Hall is today, and here it is. In the early 1890s, they're finishing up construction. The clock face isn't in yet. The bell is so enormous it cannot be rung anymore because it actually shakes the masonry joints of the tower. So it can only be rung symbolically once in a great while. It is done in the Flemish Renaissance style. When it was finished in 1893, it was the tallest inhabitable building in the United States, meaning like the Washington Monument's taller, but nobody lives in it or does business in it. It's a monumental structure. This was a building in use, and it was the tallest for a couple of years. We held that crown. Here's the old courthouse. This was built in 1870. It's on the east side. Now the courthouse is on the west side. It was on the east side, on the north border of what is now called Cathedral Square. Here's the new courthouse, built in 1929 and 1930. A whole lot of the houses and businesses along Kilburn Avenue were all destroyed to make Kilburn super wide, because these city planners wanted all that old stuff scraped out of the way, so you'd have this long promenade with the courthouse at the end. Not everybody was so in love with it, though. The architect Frank Lloyd Wright called this $1 million rock pile. He sneered at it. He hated it. There were a lot of houses downtown, even in the 20s. All through here, you can see houses all over the place. Those are all long gone. People live now in newer buildings, but there's no more private houses downtown. There's apartments and condos. Here is Milwaukee's first major industry. This is the Bayview Rolling Mill. South of it, like over here, is where the suburb of Bayview starts. The city explains to the people who live in Bayview over and over again, no, you're in Milwaukee now. And they say, no, we're not. We're in Bayview. That's their identifier, and they don't care if Bayview got annexed by Milwaukee. They're still Bayviewers, and they're insanely proud of their neighborhood. This is the Bayview Rolling Mill, and as America was building railroads everywhere, the need for iron rails was endless, and a lot of iron rails came out of here, starting in 1869. And then they switched to steel because iron wore out too quickly. The weight of the cars beat them up, and they needed replacing too often. This is all gone. It was built by a Detroit capitalist named Eber Brock Ward. This is what became the largest industrial concern in Milwaukee. This is the E.P. Alice shop on about First and Greenfield, sprawled blocks and blocks and blocks north and south, and a little bit east and west. Edward P. Alice was a brilliant engineer who built engines to turn steam into reciprocal or rotary power. And you could also run turbines off it for for electricity generation. You could do 1,000 things with his engines. He built some of the biggest engines in the world. He just had like no limits to his ambition. He was a global thinker. In about the 1920s, E.P. Alice started merging with other companies, and they needed more capital and wanted to expand their reach to be national. One of them was Chalmers Manufacturing, and so they bought half of the township of Greenfield, I think, and built what was then the largest factory in the state. And it was called Alice Chalmers, correcto. And for the whole middle part of the 20th century, this was the dominant manufacturing concern in the state. They built everything. And during the war, the World War II, probably their high point, they built everything that the military needed. In peacetime, they built farm implements. Those orange Alice Chalmers tractors were found all over the state. There is hardly anything left of it. They sold out. They were not particularly well managed, sold out to a German firm, which probably extracted whatever assets were left and then walked away from it, leaving the city of West Allis with a carcass on its hand. Piece by piece, the stuff that can't be used has been torn down, and piece by piece, it's getting retrofitted. If you drive down 70th Street today, you'll see that neighborhood's kind of perking up. In fact, you were closer. If you went to our 150th birthday party at the Gage, you were across the street from the old Alice Chalmers Works. Here's an example of how big the ships were, which would come up the river. Milwaukee did a lot of shipping in the age before the railroads dominated. And this is a large three-master, which has slid up all the way to dock at Michigan Street. You can see it's hauling lumber or possibly bark. Milwaukee had a lot of tanneries back then, and they needed sycamore bark for the tannin in the bark to treat the hides. You think this is impossible. That's a gigantic passenger ship that a tug is towing back out the river. And it was a very popular thing for that boat to dock in Milwaukee at 9 in the morning. People got on, had a nice lunch, a pleasant cruise down to Chicago. They'd have a blast visiting Chicago, get back on the boat at 8 p.m., and then the bar would open, the beer would flow, and people would be dancing and singing and carousing. About 3 hours later, it would dock, and people would stagger off after a great day. This was a big touristy thing to do. This is a little map from 1890 to show where the Germans were coming. And you can see this is what made Milwaukee 130 years ago such a German-flavored city. It was one of the most densely settled places for Germans. In fact, the literature, they would write back home to Germany and say, you'll feel right at home here. We all talk Deutsch here. Milwaukee had no parks except one for 50 years. From 1840 to 1890, there was Juneau Park on the lakefront. But Milwaukeeans didn't suffer from a lack of recreation. There were at least 15 enormous beer joints, or what did you call them? A beer garden, that's the word I was looking for, a beer garden. And this was one of the biggest of them all. Schlitz Park was on Walnut Street from 7th to 9th. It could hold 20,000 people in their beer garden. They had restaurants, bowling alleys, concert stages. There was music every night, dancing every night of the week. Here's the Schlitz Brewery, grew rapidly, eventually taking turns with Budweiser as the nation's largest brewery. Here is the Pabst Brewery, a city into itself, won the blue ribbon at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and they didn't ever let the world forget it. They put the blue ribbons on every bottle of beer after that. In fact, for years, they had actual real blue ribbons glued onto the bottles, like a blue satin ribbon. That was really kind of elegant. Here is Blatz on the east side, on Broadway and Juneau. And here's the Fred Miller Brewing Company. The three bigs were in the city. Miller was considered way out of town. They're in the Menominee Valley, farther away, but they're the last major brewery still in existence. Ironically, still brewing Pabst even today. In 1883, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad built a fabulous new terminal just south of what is now the Grand Avenue Mall, or used to be the Grand Avenue Mall, on 4th and Everett Street, it's called. An absolutely gorgeous building designed by Edward Townsend Mix. And their competitor, the Chicago and Northwestern, not to be outdone, a few years later built this imposing, massive structure at the foot of Wisconsin Avenue, right where it joined the lake. They had a fabulous view. Old-timers my age and older remember that, and maybe actually took some train trips from that beautiful station. This was Milwaukee's most beautiful commercial building, the Pabst Building, located right on the spot where Solomon Juneau's trading post had been 60 years earlier. That is the Pabst Building, built in the Flemish Renaissance. Milwaukee had the distinction of having the very first socialist mayor, and everybody was panicked. All the traditionalists were panicked that this was going to be the end, sort of like what New York City is going through right now, because the Democratic primary was won by an avowed socialist. So we'll see what happens with that. This is Daniel Hone, the bridge that people from Cudahy drive on to get to work downtown is named after him, and he served for 24 years. I think that might be a record for a Milwaukee mayor. And he was really had one leg in the democratic world. He wasn't a bomb-throwing socialist like an anarchist. In fact, his particular brand of socialists like to call themselves sewer socialists because they were into anti-corruption, clean government, and clean water for every home, and clean sanitation to suppress disease. Milwaukee, until the 1920s, until the water treatment plant had some serious investment made in it, Milwaukee was its waterways were really filthy and polluted and disease-ridden, not just from animal waste and human waste and fertilizer runoff, but industries would just dump everything into the city, thinking, not my problem anymore. So they had a lot of work to do. He eventually was ousted by Frank Zeidler in 1960 and never again achieved elective office. But Frank Zeidler was a socialist also, the last of Milwaukee's famous socialist mayors. This is Borchert Field. This is, in fact, here's today's trivia question for you. What major league team today, playing ball in the major leagues today, got its start as the original Milwaukee Brewers in 1901? Good guess, but wrong. Not the Braves. Braves didn't come to Milwaukee until 1953. I'll give you a hint. That they were sold to the St. Louis Browns, or became the St. Louis Browns. The buyer of the Brewers minor league team took it to St. Louis, made it the St. Louis Browns, where they played indifferently for 25 years until moving again. Where did they move to? Anybody know? Correct. The Baltimore Orioles. Actually, their birthplace is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, USA. Here's where they played. It's on between 7th and 8th Street on about Concordia, I think, on the near north side. The minor league Milwaukee team played there. Well, after a slow start to building parks, in the 1920s, Charles Whitnell helped design a fabulous collection of parks, most of them built along creeks and waterways, but there are now at least 120 governmentally funded and maintained green spaces in the city. We rightly have a park system we can brag about to other cities around the nation. As I said, in '53, the Braves came to Milwaukee. Where from? Boston. The Boston Braves lost one of their two teams. The other one you might have heard of, which involves the other article of clothing, is still there. But the Boston Braves came to Milwaukee. This was the beginning of County Stadium. As you could see, they couldn't afford to build the whole thing. They just built a piece of it, but Milwaukee didn't care. They loved them. And this is Milwaukee Braves mascot. That's where his teepee was, and he would come out when the people were coming through with his tomahawk and do a blood-chilling war cry. And what was his name? Anybody know? His name was Chief Nakahoma. My childhood favorite player, the great Hank Aaron, played for the Braves, absolute superstar. In 1967, all hell broke loose in Milwaukee. The racial tensions caused by a rapid escalation of the numbers of African Americans who found there was plenty of racism up north too. They thought they were escaping Jim Crow south. They found plenty of resistance. Just two people groups that just sort of collided and took a while to figure out how to live with each other. And the racial steering by realtors in those days was terrible. Insurance redlining made it very hard to get your home insured. Banks and savings and loans had areas of town that they had marked off that they would not lend to. And there were neighborhoods that would literally persecute any person of color who tried to live in it. These were very tense times. Don't look at them all as the good old days. There was some real bad old days. But then all of that tension and resentment exploded into violence. Gunfire, dozens, even hundreds of buildings set on fire. The fire department was out all day and all night for 3 straight days putting out fires. Gunshots everywhere. 4 people were killed, including a police officer. 1,700 people were arrested, and the whole city was under a curfew for 3 days. Our secretary of our church, when I came here in the early 80s, told me, she used to live across the street on Palmer Street over there, and she said for 2 days she and her sister did not leave the house. They lay on their stomachs on the floor of the living room, terrified that a bullet was coming through one of their windows. National Guard had to be called out. And all it did was it caused capital to flee, human capital, business capital, people's personal equity in their homes. People abandoned their houses, sold them for a pittance just to get out. And this whole neighborhood, which included St. Marcus's neighborhood, this hit St. Marcus very, very hard. Many other members fled, just could not, I can't take this anymore, I'm out of here. And they just took off. Even plenty of African Americans were sickened and appalled by what had happened. They left, like people who could leave, who could afford to leave, left, leaving behind just the poorest and most elderly. At the time that I came in 1980, 85% of the homes in this community were non-owner occupied. No neighborhood on earth can survive with only 15% owner occupancy. The streets were taken over by others. On a happier note, in 1953, we had a professional basketball team. Didn't last very long, but we needed a place for them to play, so the Milwaukee Arena was built. In 1965, the freeway system got underway in a big way, and now you can see today, this is our artery of transportation. The original road ran from Chicago, then I-94 out, and then slowly the 894 Beltway was added, and 43 was extended up to Sheboygan, and then different pieces of 41, 45 were added, and then 43 was extended to go towards Beloit and Janesville. In 1970, Milwaukee got a basketball team, 69, was it 69 or 70? 69. And used, they of course stank and used their number 1 position in the draft to draft the person who became their number 2 all-time scorer, who is, you know, as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. His original name in college was... Wow, have we got some basketball-savvy people here. Here was our pride and joy, built with money donated by the Bradley Foundation and by Jane Pettit Bradley, one of the heirs of the famous Bradley brothers. Our new stadium, I call it the Big Taco. And here is somebody who, as of now, is still employed by the Bucks, although his newspapers have been trying to say he's ready to be traded at any time. You are looking at Milwaukee's all-time leading scorer. The lakefront, starting with Mayor Meyer, became the home of a series of festivals, the biggest of which is Summerfest, known around the world for our music festivals. Big investments along the river. It used to be a polluted stench. It was an open sewer. It is now an actual really cool place people want to live on and love driving their boats up and down. And as you can see, the sidewalks on the Riverwalk are packed with people sitting, having something to eat or a cocktail. County Stadium got updated to Miller Park, now called American Family Field. We have come to the end. Obviously, sorry, you're probably going to tell me, I can't believe you talked about the history of Milwaukee, and you didn't mention this. And I'm saying I'm 10 minutes over already. Couldn't pack anymore, and I talked as fast as my lips would move. Hope you had fun with that. Next week, we will study the history of our neighborhood. It's a very interesting part of Milwaukee.